first speaker to introduce herself, and that's Elizabeth Mayne.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here on Mayne Island. I want to thank Bob McGuinness and the Mayne Island Resident and Ratepayers Association, and I'm going to depart from anything I might have been planning to say to suggest that all of us at this table should step down in order that Elma can go to the House of Commons and be Speaker of the House. I think it's desperately needed to have someone to bring order and decorum to the House of Commons, and I appreciate the rules that have been set up before us. A lot of you, I know a lot of you in the audience, but some of you don't know me at all, so I will introduce myself as someone who has worked my whole life for a better world. I was very fortunate to be raised up to do that by a mom who decided when I was an infant that there was something wrong with nuclear weapons testing and atmospheric distribution of radioactive fallout. So I grew up watching what I understood as a small child to be my mommy getting the heads of the Soviet Union and the United States and the UK to stop something dangerous. And I think it influenced me, no doubt, for my whole life. I became interested in doing environmental work when I was in high school. I set my sights on being an environmental lawyer. I was somewhat thrown off course by my parents deciding to open a restaurant and gift shop on the Cabot Trail, deciding that this would be a pleasant semi-retirement where tourists love driving around the Cabot Trail, and then the oil shock hit. So I spent my 20s not going to university, but waitressing and cooking in my family business. And as a mature student, I was fortunate to discover that there was such a thing as going to law school without an undergrad degree. By that point, I'd become quite, I suppose, I had a reputation that was quite positive in Nova Scotia for having worked at the grassroots level to ensure that our island was not sprayed with chemical insecticides from the air. And I went on while in law school to wage a court battle for what would have been the last legal use of Agent Orange anywhere in Canada. Yeah. And I would continue as a lawyer practicing law, and ultimately went to Ottawa for something called the Public Interest Advocacy Center, which asked me to come represent at that level anti-poverty groups and other environmental groups. So I loved practicing law. I was pulled away from that quite unexpectedly by the Federal Minister of Environment at the time. In the Progressive Conservative government of Brian Mulroney, I was asked to come on board as the Senior Policy Advisor to a Minister of Environment from PEI by the name of Tom McMillan. So I worked at the federal level for 2 years. Tremendous blessing that experience was. I learned how government works. And in an era when, compared to what we see today, we had quite strong levels of respect, quite significant levels of nonpartisan cooperation. And the things I worked on, the issues of concern at the time where I gave my whole self to getting over unbelievable obstacles, included getting a national park in Guayahans within Haida Gwaii, getting agreements to stop acid rain in the 7 eastern provinces, as well as the negotiation with the United States on the acid rain agreements. We got a protocol to protect the ozone layer. These were all issues I worked on when I was in government. After 2 years, I sadly had to step down on a matter of conscience and principle. When my boss broke the law, I was very sad about it because, as you can imagine, I was very fond of him, and I went away experiencing a lot of the things that whistleblowers experience. And in about a year, I found a new role, and that was Executive Director of the Sierra Club of Canada, a position I held for 17 years. It was in that role that I, both within working in government and at Sierra Club, that I spent a lot of my time in the Gulf Islands and southern Vancouver Island. It's our biggest chapter. The strongest aspect of our work across the country was here, always has been. And I'm now tremendously honored to be the leader of the Green Party. I was elected in 2006 as leader. I moved to Sydney, British Columbia in the summer of 2009, and I'm your candidate here locally. I can tell you that the things in my life that I'm proudest of, well, someone noticed earlier I'm wearing the pin as an Officer of the Order of Canada, a position and an honor I received in 2005. I've had a lot of honors and awards earlier today. This was a very lovely endorsement that the conservation voters of British Columbia have endorsed me in this riding. But the thing I'm proudest of in this whole world is sitting in the front row, and that's my daughter, Victoria Kate, and my older stepkids and 7 grandkids. Family always means the most. And our platform, when you look at it, I think you'll be really pleased. The Green Party is a lot more than you think it is. It's It's not just about the environment. It's about how to have a healthy economy, strong communities, and make sure we take care of each other. Our healthcare system, our plans for our future are all about making sure that we have the kinds of communities that sustain a healthy life for all Canadians. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I think you managed to do that in pretty much 5 minutes. So that's very good information for the rest of you. I'm going to now ask our second speaker, which is Edith. I'll pass the microphone to her.
Thank you, Alma. I was trying to give one of my volunteers here a cue that give me 1 minute notice, and I don't think she was getting it. Anyway, my name is Edith Maureen Kuhunga, and I'm
for human rights if it stands for anything, and we should protect all our citizens wherever they are in the world.
And I agree as well. I think that as an Indigenous person, and when I travel throughout the world, I really believe that if I'm traveling abroad and something goes wrong, I would hope that my government would come to my aid. And certainly we've seen in the last few cases where planes have left countries empty instead of having Canadian citizens on them. And so, I agree that human rights, and I think back of Omar, and I think back of the 11-year-old boy that has just been tasered in Prince George by the RCMP. I think of those kinds of things, and I think that Canada needs to stand up for its citizens, and we need to be looking at children. We need to be doing a better job at looking after our children. Thank you.
Edward, I too am ashamed. Remember what I said at the beginning. I said this was about you. The primary responsibility of a government, irrespective of party, the primary responsibility is the protection of its citizens. And if the government fails to do that, they fail in their most fundamental and important job. Clearly, I'm extremely saddened by the deterioration of upholding this incredibly important principle.
First of all, let me just say Omar Kadar faces very serious charges, accused of actually killing some of the NATO forces in Afghanistan, and I'll leave it at that. There's a process that's happening, and he's accused of a very serious crime. We've helped many, many Canadians abroad, and we continue to do that. We'll continue to do that. I will say this about our Prime Minister. I've never seen a man defend human rights on the world stage like he has, whether it be in Afghanistan, right now in Libya, and he is doing, he's the first one to stand up and ensure. And I truly believe that, and I believe that the record speaks for itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Our next speaker, and we will allow the other candidates, any candidate to answer. You don't have to, of course, if you don't wish to, but and we'll try this. Seems appears to be going along quite well. And by the way, this is not up to me. This is a format that has been put forward by the Mayne Island Residents Ratepayers Association in an attempt not to keep you out, but to give everybody an opportunity to ask a question. The next speaker is Alan Ryder.
My question to the candidates concerns support for the arts in Canada in general, and more specifically, candidates' attitude and the party's platform's attitude towards the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation in terms of long-term stable funding. We've addressed the general support for arts first and the CPC second. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to pass the mic to Barry first, and we'll come back the other way.
Thank you very much. Funding is at an all-time high for the CBC. It's something that we're committed to, and well,
excuse me.
Again, these numbers are all a matter of public record, so and it's publicly available. Anybody can see that. You can look at the recent budget that was just tabled, where there was additional money again for the CBC.
$43 million.
Excuse me.
That's not true.
I'm sorry, sir. You are out of order.
Okay, I'll just repeat it. It is at an all-time high, and again, anybody, I would challenge them. The numbers are publicly available, so you can research it and see it for yourself. You know, as far as the arts program, in their most recent budget, one of the things that we brought in previous budgets was we brought a $500 tax credit, a fitness tax credit for children up to the age of 16. We're now extending that into arts programs as well, in addition to the many other events that are things that we fund for the arts. It's something that we're very, very proud of, and the Minister of Heritage, James Moore, who's also from British Columbia, is doing an incredible job. Thank you.
So I just want to read you a few quotes here. The promotion and development of our culture, which includes 1 million Canadian workers, are an absolute priority for the Liberal Party of Canada. The work of our artists and musicians is valuable to the culture of Canada, and it should be protected, and they should be properly paid. I'll quote something else for you, right out of the platform here. We will ensure public broadcasters, Radio-Canada and CBC can continue to play their crucial role in providing Canadian content, culture, and identity. Culture, the people who are our artists and our musicians are the leading edge of culture and innovation in our country. They go out into the unknown. They step over the edge, and they tell us, then they come back and tell us what they found. And then we learn from that. Without culture, without art, from my very own research, it tells me that without culture and music and our artists, we do not develop the capacity to innovate and change, to respond to a challenging and changing world. These people are absolutely critical to our capacity to evolve and adjust to a very challenging world that we and our children face. Thank you.
I too agree, and I think that we've really looked at the NDP. When I look at the platform that the NDP has put forward, we want to ensure that Canada's arts and culture thrive. I mean, it's really who we are as Canada. When we look at the multicultural society that we have, it's really about who we are and what we represent. And so some of the things that the NDP are committed to doing is continuing to build homegrown film and TV production, make sure there's sustained funding for the Canada Media Fund and Telefilm Canada. We want to develop a targeted strategy to address that. We want to establish and set a license requirements for broadcasters. And we want to invest in our shared cultural heritage. And when I think about that, I think about all of the, that we know that CBC has went through drastic cuts. And I think that I grew up on CBC. I remember when I was a little girl, we didn't have electricity in our home. So once a week, we got to pipe it in from our neighbor, and it was sitting down watching CBC. So I have such admiration for CBC. And, when Renee and I went down to the CBC radio last week to be interviewed, I reflect back on the importance of CBC. It's one of our oldest institutions, and we need to protect it, and I would definitely do that.
Yes, just to get some more historical perspective on this, the CBC's funding was cut by a third in the Liberal years. It's not recovered. It's not at record highs. The Minister of State for Culture, Dean Del Mastro, speaking before the Heritage Committee for the Harper government, recently said it's time to ask whether the government should be in the public broadcasting business. This doesn't suggest a commitment to long-term stable funding for the CBC. We're the only federal political party that's put arts and culture up front and center in our platform. You can find a commitment to $450 billion over the next 3 years to CBC. It's all costed. It shows how we pay for it. It shows how we bring down the deficit at the same time. And a commitment to arts and culture includes 4 pages of detail within Vision Green of things like help the artist community by allowing tax averaging. We all know that someone who's writing a book may go several lean years and the book is published. They get hit with taxes if they win a prize in 1 year or produce a show in 1 year. They need to average out those taxes. We need to treat the arts and culture community in a way that allows them to survive and make an income. More support to Canada Arts Council, more support to CBC and Hydro-Canada. And in light of the recent decision of the CBC to keep me out of the debates, I've taken to saying Greens will support public broadcasting even when public broadcasting doesn't support us. Thank you very much.
Our next questioner is Richard Iredale.
Hi, everybody. I'd just like to say welcome, candidates to Mayne Island. It's a great pleasure to have you here on our friendly little rock. My question has to do with climate change, and I know that's a word that the Conservatives would rather disappeared. Nothing has been done, I believe, really to try and combat climate change during the last 5 Harper years. I think it's a tragedy. But I'd like to ask each candidate to tell us what you would do about developing renewable energy in Canada, and particularly how you would try to develop green jobs. I think Canada stands to get left behind by Europe and by the rest of the world. If they all develop their green energy, we will have our head in the tar sands. We'll be developing cheap tar sands. I understand that Minister Lund suggested building nuclear reactors to get enough energy to pull the tar out of the sands. Great idea, thank you. But if you could please, each of you, address that.
And this time we'll go back the other way.
Thank you, Richard. I wish I could agree with you that the Harper government has done nothing on the climate change issue, but they've done a great deal of damage. It would have been better if they'd left what was there in place instead of canceling the programs that were very much late in the day, brought in by previous Liberal governments, but they were all canceled, and our repudiation of the Kyoto Protocol means that we are globally lawbreakers. That was an internationally, legally binding treaty. Now, actually, in terms of job creation, I think the immediate potential for massive job creation comes in energy retrofits, conservation, energy efficiency improvements. Energy productivity improvements, such as dealing with the fact that 30% of greenhouse gases in Canada come from leaky, inefficient buildings. So retrofits involve all the trades, carpenters, plumbers, electricians, in getting buildings to be as energy efficient as possible. We currently waste more than half the energy we use in Canada, so plugging the leaks is by far our most cost-effective immediate step and creates the most jobs. Then we're building ourselves some time to create more jobs in renewable energy. No question we're falling behind. Every other country on the planet, including developing countries like India and China and Brazil, took their economic stimulus packages in the face of the recession and invested enormous resources into investing in a post-carbon economy, getting more renewable energy developed, solar panels, advanced technologies, renewables. Our proposal is to move very quickly to create the incentives for wind, for solar, for low-flow tidal, for geothermal, for the whole 9 yards, and recognizing we're just scratching the surface of an enormously exciting technological revolution that will replace fossil fuels in our lifetime. Because the failure is not an option. This is our kids' survival we're talking about. We cannot afford to continue to act as though the climate crisis isn't real, or we can afford to continue to pretend that an addiction to fossil fuels is not a fundamental problem.
So when I take a look at what the NDP have agreed to do, certainly it's along some of the same lines that Elizabeth has mentioned, and adopting in terms of being accountable and reintroducing legislation to greenhouse gas emissions to a level of 80% below that of 1990 by the year 2050. Putting a price on carbon through a cap and trade system, looking at not only what we're doing here, but internationally and the effect that climate change is having internationally. And when I traveled to Tanzania in the last little while, over a year ago, I saw the impact that climate change was having on the indigenous people over there. When they relied on their only source of food was through fish and through the water, and their lakes were drying up. I could see the impact that it was having. And as an indigenous person, I can tell you that the indigenous people who continue to live off the land and the water are greatly impacted. And I will stand up and continue to fight to address the climate change, because I believe that if we don't, what are we going to have left? And when I look at some of the poorest countries, they still continue to depend on the land and the water. And we need to do something about it. As Canadians, not only just looking after ourselves, but looking after the impacts that it's having on those developed countries as well. Thank you.
Well, if I didn't feel strongly about this issue, I wouldn't be standing here. I'd be sitting over there. But you know what? The time for talk is over. There's a lot of talk. There's a lot of hot air about this subject, but what we need is action. And that's why you're looking at a climate scientist now who is running in the Liberal Party of Canada. I have spoken to Michael Ignatieff personally about this. I put forward the climate policy that actually made it into the Liberal Party platform. It came out of this very riding. And Michael Ignatieff has promised me that when I get elected, that he will work directly with me, and we will ensure that actually something happens. And that's what you need. I need a team behind me. I need a party behind me that believes in me, that respects my scientific background, my experience, my knowledge, my desire to see change, and actually implements it. So some suggestions on how that's going to happen. What we need to do is invest in clean energy. We need to shift ourselves from our dependency, because we have become dependent on fossil fuels, to an economy which is far less dependent on fossil fuels. And we do that by helping people renovate their homes, giving them a $13,500 tax credit, so that they can renovate their homes to make them more energy efficient, reduces their energy bills, but it also helps to build a clean energy economy. And the government will do that. The new government. Sorry, I just have to do that. They'll do that in our federal buildings as well, because what you want to do is build that new business, and not only that, but help those innovative new entrepreneurs by providing them what's called flow-through capital, so that people that invest in those businesses, which are really risky and they have a lot of trouble getting capital, help them by providing flow-through shares, so people get a tax credit for helping those people. We also have the cap and trade, also insisting on maintaining our global average surface air temperatures to less than 2 degrees centigrade. I must tell you that at the scientific conference I was at in Copenhagen, it was, the scientific evidence suggests that we're heading for between 2 and 3. And every day, every minute, every week, every month that we wait to do something pushes us closer to 3. So we don't have 30 years for the Green Party to catch up.
Well, thank you very much. Actually, this is an issue that I deeply care about, and I just want to speak about the facts. And it's well known that when we took office in 2006, greenhouse gases were 33% higher than 2000 levels. 33% higher. 33% higher. The Liberal Party, they were there for 13 years. Yes, they signed the Kyoto Accord to get -6%, but they went up and up and up and up and up and up every single year.
What's happened?
That's well documented. What's happened since then? We've actually turned the corner and actually started driving down. We've invested $3.6 billion in clean energy technologies. We've put in a massive amount of wind energy onto the grid across Canada. We're investing in tidal turbine. We're investing in clean energy technologies. We're investing in energy efficiency. In this last budget, it was $400 million for the continuation of the Eco Energy Retrofit Program. That's a program that I put in place that I was a minister. So there's many, many things that we're doing. But the truth is, when you're going to start to see even greater reductions, it's when every single person in this room, it's when Canadians are willing to change their lifestyles, make a difference. We become more energy efficient. And there's so much more that we can do. I agree. But we all probably got in a car, or many of us did. We get on planes. We all use fossil fuels, myself included. So it's fair to stand up and just say, well, it's the government's fault. But unless we all take responsibility and start doing action, that's when we're going to make progress. We have made significant investments. If we were going to achieve Kyoto Accord, we'd have had to shut down the Canadian economy. Let me just talk one last second about the Copenhagen Accord, which we signed in 2009. We brought in countries like Brazil, like India, like China, which were not part of Kyoto. The Copenhagen Accord has over 100 countries, which represents 85% of the planet's greenhouse gas emissions. That's a plan that we can make move forward, and that's a plan we're committed to. We are committed to reducing greenhouse gases 17% below 2005 levels by 2020. The same target as the United States. We're in a combined economy, and we can achieve that. We can achieve that. It's a goal. It's an aggressive goal, but it can be achieved. But there's a lot more work to be done. And sitting here pointing fingers and saying who did what in the past isn't going to get us anywhere. It's by working together. Thank you.
Can I make a correction? Mr. Lund, that's not correct that Canadian CO2 levels were 33% higher in 2006 than they were in 2000. That's not a correct fact. About 13% higher. You're going to be in charge of the portfolio. We should know the facts.
I know the facts, and you're welcome.
Okay.
They're all publicly available, so again,
How did you memorize them?
we're
Okay.
33% above targets.
Okay, I think we just take a little deep breath here. I reminded you at the beginning, this is not question period in the House. This is not the debate. Thank you. We're moving on to the next questioner, which is David Burrows.
Good afternoon, my name is Dave Burrows. Yeah, I'll treat it like an ice cream cone. Hello?
It's on.
Our current Prime Minister seems to be treating his position of leadership with arrogance and disdain for the democratic process. He keeps saying the C word is coalition, and it seems that it's rather contempt for Parliament. I'd like to hear your comments on this.
with Elizabeth May. I think it's Elizabeth's turn.
Thank you for the question, Dave. I didn't mention earlier that one of the things I do and love doing a lot is writing books. And my last book, my seventh book, was called Losing Confidence, Power, Politics, and the Crisis in Canadian Democracy. And I wrote it because after the 2008 election, I'm desperately concerned about the trends in Canadian democracy, low voter turnout particularly, the fact that 41% of Canadians didn't vote in the last election. I think it's directly related to Canadians looking at what they see in Parliament and thinking, I'm not proud of that. I don't want to participate in that. And then they make the mistake of thinking not voting somehow is a protest. As I wrote the book, we had the first prorogation of Parliament. I was writing in my book about the fact that the Harper government has asked the Conservative committee chairs to disrupt their own hearings if they don't like what a witness is saying, throw down their pencil and storm from the room. I wrote about the fact that the growth in power of the Prime Minister's office, which started at the time of Pierre Trudeau, has now become so overreaching that all important government decisions are made in the Prime Minister's office and not in the House of Commons. They keep expanding that budget, they keep expanding the number of people who work there, and their whole goal is to help get their party re-elected. The contempt sightings of this government, Mr. Harper shrugged them off and said, win some, lose some. But all the academics who study Canadian parliamentary democracy pointed out that this government has shown more contempt for parliamentary institutions, more disrespect for the fundamental principle of Westminster parliamentary democracy, that the House of Commons is supreme to any particular government, and that information must be shared, documents must be tabled, and no minister of the Crown should mislead the House without immediately resigning. The whole treatment of the House of Commons, which is the treatment of our democracy, which is the treatment of our citizens, has been from this government more contemptuous than anything we've experienced in our history. And it actually represents a fundamental threat to our democracy, which is why I'm hoping to be your representative, to be a voice in Ottawa that can actually do something about it. Thank you.
I too am hoping to be in the House, so I can do something about it. And I think, when I take a look at, what has happened, I agree that, Stephen Harper and the Conservatives have been a disaster in terms of democracy and standing up for, at least for me, as a Canadian. And so I believe that, when I think of, the bad word C coalition, and I agree, when I looked into it, I thought, my goodness, there has never been another country in the Commonwealth that has fallen because of contempt. That's pretty sad. And to think that I'm appalled at how many Canadians aren't talking about that. We're not talking about that. When we look at the statistics and we see what's going on, we're not talking about that. We need to be talking about that. And I believe that we also need to have Parliament representing the people that it serves. And right now we don't see that. And I feel that I could certainly bring the voice to that. So I agree. I think that, we definitely need a big time change in government.
So I would agree. We have never seen contempt of Parliament in the history of Canada nor the Commonwealth. Contempt of Parliament is contempt of the members of Parliament. The members of Parliament are you. They're your representatives. So when we say contempt of Parliament, we're saying contempt of the people, contempt of you. Now, take this back to the beginning. There's also the prorogation that happened, if you recall. But there's also the muzzling of scientists. So we're muzzling our scientists. We're firing our watchdogs. I want to read you this list somebody just handed me the other day. I won't read the whole thing because it's kind of long. Organizations and watchdogs whose staff have been fired, forced out, publicly maligned, or who have resigned in protest. Canada Firearms Program Chief Superintendent. Canadian Wheat Board President and CEO. Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission Linda Keane. Foreign Affairs Richard Colvin. Military Police Commission Head Peter Tinsley. Ombudsman for the Department of National Defence and Canadian Forces Yves Cote. Parliamentary Budget Officer Kevin Page, funding cut. RCMP Police Complaints Commission Paul Kennedy, Chair. Rights and Democracy President Rene Beauregard. Statistics Canada, Mayor Chic, my friend Colonel Pat Stobrin, Veterans Ombudsman, and Victims of Crime Ombudsman Steve Sullivan. This list goes on for another page and a half. I can't do that because I only have 30 seconds.
Somehow I think it's 3 against 1, but that's good. Makes it more fun.
It's not you.
I love you too, anyway. But first of all, on the contempt charge, it was a confidence motion, but the Liberals framed it in the wording of contempt. It was over production of documents. We believe we produced all of those documents, and no matter what we could do, we were going to face that. But the people who really get to decide on this are the voters of Canada. We're in an election. So they defeat us, had a confidence motion, they defeated the government, and let the voters decide. Again, I'm proud of my record. I said this yesterday at Pender. You know, when I was first elected, we had 2 majorities with John Chrétien as the Prime Minister. And it was a whole different atmosphere in the House when I was there. You had colleagues, you had friends. All the parties were colleagues, but you had friends. You went out for dinners with other parliamentarians from other parties. You know, you sat down, you had committees, you worked together. And it hasn't been that way. It hasn't been that way recently with the minority parliament. And it's sad. It's sad. I mean, I remember bringing the Fisheries Committee out here and was a member of that. But, you know, it's, I think everybody needs to look at themselves and say, how do we make this place work? We're all colleagues. We all get elected. We get elected on a platform. We genuinely believe, no matter what we would have done, you know, the 3 parties were going to gang up on us and vote, saying that we didn't produce the documents. In fact, we reproduced them and did it again. But, the result was obvious what was going to happen. So having said that, you get to decide. You get to decide. And we'll accept the decision of the Canadian people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, candidates. We will now move on to our next questioner, which is, it looks like it's Ed Peterson.
I suppose I should address my question to Gary Lunn. The question is this. A few years ago, an industry minister fired the nuclear expert who advocated the closing of some of the reactors at Chalk River on the basis of nuclear danger. In the light of what has happened at Fukushima, would you say that that industry minister perhaps made a mistake in carrying out that firing of people, of a person who was advocating greater nuclear safety in Canada? I hope all the candidates get a chance to answer this question.
I'm sure they will. First of all, just let me say this. The situation that happened with the NRU at Chalk River at that point in time, there was there's multiple backup systems, and one of them was not hooked up. We heard, and this was the reactor that produced medical isotopes. We heard from all the expert witnesses who testified that the reactor was operating right at that time far safer than it ever had before in its 50-year history, and that there was absolutely no risk. I would just say this, it was Parliament who overruled the regulator at that time. It was not, it wasn't the Conservative Party, it was not the Prime Minister. Ms. Keane at that time testified before Parliament and late in the evening, as well as did other independent nuclear experts, as well as did nuclear engineers from ACL. And they all, it was actually how Parliament should work. You know, there was really serious questions by all the parties, and they were all looking for the right answer. And all of the witnesses had all the time they needed to respond. And only at the conclusion of that evidence that was put before Parliament did Parliament vote unanimously every single party voted to overrule Miss Keene. And that's the absolute facts, that's the records that happened at that time, and you can draw your own conclusions from that. But the facts are, it was Parliament, and every single party voted unanimously to overrule her at the time. Thank you very much for your question.
Oh, Gary. You know what? When you get elected to be member of Parliament, you're responsible for your actions. As I said yesterday at Pender, Linda Keene was fired the night before she was to appear in committee the next day. And the person who fired her was Gary Lunn. Now, I don't know whether Gary Lunn made the decision or he was told to do it. But as I said yesterday at Pender Island, if that was me, and I was in your shoes, Gary, I would have told the Prime Minister, fire me first.
So all I can add to that is when we take a look at what's happening in Japan, I think one of the big things that we have to take a look at is public safety. And instead of just going ahead with nuclear energy, and I think that that's one of the big things that we keep on missing. What it is in terms of public safety, and how do we address that before anything else, before big corporations, and before all of the money.
It falls to me to try to explain to you the chronology of events so that you can make sense of the answer from Gary Lunn and the answer from my colleagues on the table. It is true that every party voted to overrule the regulator and force a restart of the Chalk River NRU reactor. It is true there wasn't a single MP who stood up for Linda Keene and the decisions of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, and the only reason for that is that I hadn't been elected yet, and there was no one to stand up for nuclear safety. The other part of it that's also true is what Renee just said. There were two separate events. In December of 2007, when the Chalk River reactor had been closed down for routine repairs, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission inspectors discovered it was operating in violation of its license and had been doing so for some considerable time because they had neglected to install the backup system because the Chalk River NRU reactor is in an earthquake zone and was required by its license to have a backup system in the event of an earthquake. Does this sound familiar? It's the scenario that happened in Fukushima. Where an earthquake knocked out the power system, you need a system to keep coolant on the reactor. At the time of that controversy, there was a very, very unacceptable, one-sided, late-night meeting of Parliament where they literally put witnesses in the middle of the chamber before the Speaker of the House. They called witnesses that were entirely in the pocket of the industry. They were Atomic Energy of Canada witnesses, and Linda Keene put her view forward, and as far as Linda Keene was concerned, her job as a regulator was to enforce the Canadian Nuclear Safety Act. And if Parliament chose to ignore the safety issues and force a reopening of the reactor against its own license requirements, then she had fulfilled her responsibility. It was a month later, it was in January, that Gary Lunn fired Linda Keene, calling her at 11 o'clock on a Friday night to remove her as the head of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. As Sheila Fraser, our Auditor General, said at the time, this would have a chilling effect on the entire civil service. The list Renee began to read out are the heads that have rolled or been threatened with a government that has politicized what should be arm's-length regulation to ensure nuclear safety, food safety, water pollution guidelines. All the aspects of government decision-making that should never be politicized have been contaminated by a political stain that began the night that Gary Lunn fired Linda Keene. And that's the record, and that's why we need Greens in the House of Commons.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, you have two questions there, so I'll try to deal with them quickly. There was a tax subsidy for exploration for companies on the exploration side in the oil sands. That was actually brought in by Anne McClellan when she was the Minister of Natural Resources, and that is something that we removed in the 2007 budget. Again, it's easily to find those documents, but the tax credit for companies doing exploration work in the oil sands was actually ended by our government. So there's I know people like to say we're giving tax breaks, but that's simply not the case. We are actually providing, we're doing some research and actually working with some of the companies on actually clean technologies. I know some of the companies have removed almost all the sulfur from their production. So through our Clean Technology Fund, there actually is working with some of the companies to actually reduce the environmental footprint. We can get on why it's there. I mean, it's 15% of the world's known oil reserves. Do you want to go get our oil from Saudi Arabia? Do you want to get it from other places? It's, I think what we should be doing is, one, decreasing our dependency on fossil fuels. I fundamentally believe that. It's something that we all have to work on, but that's not going to happen overnight. And secondly, we should be developing cleaner technologies for both the use of any kind of...
Although I agree with much of what my colleagues at the table have said, I'm going to go back to Al's question and trying to get to the specific things he asked. In terms of subsidies to the development of the oil sands in Alberta, in our position, the Green Party, is we should have a moratorium on any new projects, hold it to where we are right now, which is about 1.6 million barrels of oil a day, reduce the water content and the energy content per barrel before we have any further expansion. But what are we putting in there in terms of taxpayers' dollars? Gary's right. It started under Chrétien. In 1996, former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien created a very favorable tax climate to encourage development of the oil sands because a barrel of oil was selling for under $30 a barrel in the global market, and oil sands oil simply wasn't commercial. So they created a very large benefit to oil companies. As one U.S. congressman once said, subsidizing an oil company to find oil is like subsidizing a fish to swim. But we've been doing it, folks. We've been giving some of the largest, wealthiest corporations on earth our tax dollars to develop bitumen. It comes to $1.3 billion a year in accelerated capital cost allowance. Now, in 2009, Prime Minister Stephen Harper attended the G8 in Pittsburgh, in which we pledged with every other G8 country that we would end fossil fuel subsidies. There was a memo leaked, the Deputy Minister of Finance, Michael Horgan's memo, in which he described the difficulty he was having post the G8 summit because the Harper government simply did not want to stop subsidizing the oil sands, nor have they done so yet. Gary's correct that they stopped the exploration subsidy, but the accelerated capital cost allowance subsidy continues. And it is further a subsidy to put billions of dollars into carbon capture and storage. That's merely another disguised subsidy to the oil sands. It's a further disguised subsidy to the oil sands to have a Liberal plan to stop the subsidies, but then give the companies the money back to clean up their act. They can clean up their own act. They're the richest companies on earth, and regulations should be the way that we teach them to clean up their act. We stand firmly against the Enbridge pipeline. We're against the Enbridge pipeline because, again, the level of oil being produced, the bitumen crude coming out of the oil sands, is being sent down to the States primarily. And it's another small point to Gary. We do import. In this country, we're net importers of oil. All of Eastern Canada is dependent on crude from Venezuela, from Nigeria, from the OPEC countries. And most of our production, virtually from the oil sands, is being shipped down in pipelines to the United States. We need to think through an energy strategy for Canada. We need to stop thinking of ourselves. We used to be hewers of wood and drawers of water. We're now scrapers of bitumen and wasters of water. We need to think like a country. We need to defend energy sovereignty and have a plan that makes sense for all Canadians. And the oil sands by itself is not an energy plan.
Well, that makes the choice easy. They're going to get neither.
Thank you, Steve, for the question, because it allows us to go back to the earlier contretemps. And I think, Gary, with all due respect, you misspoke yourself when you said, and I quote, 33%. The emissions in Canada were 33% higher in the year 2000 now that when the Liberals, due to Liberal policies. In fact, what I think you meant to say is that the emissions went in 2006, when the Harper government, formed government, was 33% higher than 6% below 1990 levels, which was our target. Now, in fact, you also said that the current Copenhagen Accord, which all people working to actually see emissions reduced do not regard as a hopeful document. It was not negotiated through the United Nations process, and it is not acceptable to anyone who wants to see emissions kept to a temperature below 2 degrees Celsius. And lastly, Canada's target is the weakest in the world. You said it was the same as the U.S. That's strictly true because it's both 17% below 2005 levels by 2020. But when Canada does that, we remain well above 1990 levels, whereas in the U.S., because they had different levels of emissions in 2005, their emissions would be below 1990 levels. We have the weakest target in the industrialized world and no plan to get there.
Whatever you say.
Brian, you raise an excellent question. In terms of global food security, this is one of the places where we're already seeing the impacts of the climate crisis. There was a recent review of all the food policy programs from all the parties in this current federal election, and the note was made in the Globe and Mail that the Greens were the only party to recognize that climate change was having an impact on food security. The global food crisis had a lot to do with grain basket areas like Russia and China experiencing some severe weather events, and our prairies as well. For local food security, we need to look at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency and for food safety. That agency is wrong from the get-go because it was created with a dual mandate to promote the export of Canadian food products while regulating Canadian food products. If you read the report that looked at the listeriosis crisis in Canada, you find that there was a hesitation to act at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency because they're also promoting Canadian exports. So do you start saying, gee, the luncheon meats for Maple Leaf may be a risk. If you act too quickly, you might hurt our exports. If you act in time, you might save lives. They picked the wrong side of that dilemma. So we need to be clear about food safety. That report also noted that with the increased centralization of production, the increased corporate control of food production, we're seeing a greater risk of food contamination spread over wide areas. Now, this is the report that the government commissioned on what happened with listeriosis. Did they then conclude we had to return to local food security, to greater support for our farmers, to more farm gate access to slaughterhouses? No. They said we just need to put more inspectors on and more chemical cleaning because they can't question the model, what the progress trap they've fallen into of constantly increased corporate control and more mechanized processed foods. We need to stop having the focus of our food policy, what's good for Cargill and what's good for Monsanto. We need to make our food policy about what's good for farmers and local food security in the Gulf Islands and right across Canada.
And we're the ones who created the Veterans Ombudsman, and he was not removed. His actually term ended, so he was a 5-year appointment, and at the end of his appointment, and it's widely known in those positions, in many of the positions, that you don't continue on with the same person. That it's up for, it's the Lieutenant Governor, the Governor General, in most appointments inside Canadian Forces. Once they finish their appointment, you appoint somebody. And in fact, we applauded his work. It's so important that a government is transparent and accountable. And I absolutely believe that, we fulfill that each and every day. We brought in the Federal Accountability Act. Somebody asked about MP's expenses. All the House leaders got together. All members of Parliament's expenses are posted online.
Ferd, your question is a really important one. I'm glad you raised it. It was one of the things that I wished I'd been in the federal leaders debate to talk about, because the treatment of the Harper government, this is always very awkward, because I think Garland actually believes what he's saying, that he stands for these things, but you can't stand for these things and be part of the Harper government because they stand against them. And that's a very fundamental problem. The so-called Veterans Charter of Rights that the Harper government brought in changed the way veterans receive their disability payments. We've all heard about this. It's horrible to give them a single lump sum payment when you come home from war without your leg, and you're going to be getting a lump sum payment one time in your life. What happens 20, 30 years from now? Canadian citizens have an obligation to look after the young men and women who come back from war. We've sent them into war, and if they come back disabled, they need a check for the rest of their lives. We shouldn't be trying to find a sharp practice to save a bit of money by not taking care of our veterans. The same thing with clawback on veterans' benefits. It's really Orwellian that they managed to call this thing the Charter of Rights for Veterans, because it has disadvantaged veterans right down the line. And I'm very proud that Sean Bruya, who's a strong advocate for veterans, someone who in his Gulf War experience came back and was denied benefits, and then his own government leaked his confidential health records to try to discredit him to the media and the public. This treatment of our veterans is shameful, and Sean Bruya wrote me to say how glad he was that the Greens had so strongly embraced the things that veterans deserve and will be pursuing an agenda to give veterans the disability payments they deserve, the respect they deserve, the long-term treatment that they need for the trauma they received in wartime. These are minimum obligations of a civilized society towards its veterans. I think this election is really a lot about democracy. It did start with a vote in which the government fell on a contempt issue. We've seen a lot of abuse of our democracy. And I lay the blame not at any one party or any one person, but on the system. We're seeing all the political parties in the House of Commons in the grip of a kind of toxic partisanship. You may have heard Keith Martin explain the reasons he wasn't going to run again as a Liberal MP in Esquimalt Fuca. He referred to it as rabid partisanship. We see every party in the House of Commons, instead of working in the public interest and looking at an issue and saying, how can I work to solve this? How can I work across party lines? We've seen a real deterioration of civility, real deterioration of respect across party lines, an unwillingness to work together. And it's endemic to all the old line parties. It's not that the wonderful people who are at this table with me wouldn't want to do their best. It's that the system in which they find themselves, top-down political boss management, with a constant goal of winning at all costs, without remembering what they're winning for, what the purpose of government is. Our Constitution tells us that it's peace, order, and good government. Very stodgy when you compare it to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the U.S., but I love our parliamentary democratic traditions and the fact that our Constitution tells us that our government should be about peace, order, and good government. And good government requires something entirely different from what we're seeing today. Gary's reflected on the fact that when he got elected 14 years ago, things were different. I think they were different not because it was a majority government, but because it was a time when there was more cooperation, a time when we didn't see this invasive, nasty, toxic partisanship. And I pledge that if you should do me the honor of sending me to Ottawa, I can be a voice for something different, restore respect and civility, and heckling in the House of Commons at question period, and run things more or less the way Alma has been running this meeting. Thank you very much.